They call it the fighter that won the war. The P-51 Mustang, sleek and silver, roaring across the sky at 440 miles per hour, powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine screaming at full throttle. It could fly from England to Berlin and back, escorting bombers deep into Germany, shooting down Luftwaffe fighters, dominating the skies. By the end of World War II, P-51 Mustangs had destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter. It was fast, maneuverable, beautiful, and deadly. Aviation historians worship it. Museums display it with reverence. Veterans talk about it with love in their voices. But here is what they do not tell you. The P-51 Mustang was almost canceled before it ever reached production. The British designed the engine that made it great because the American engine was a complete failure. And during its development and early combat service, the Mustang killed dozens of American pilots through design flaws, mechanical failures, and catastrophic engine problems that the Army Air Forces covered up to maintain morale. This is the dark story of the best fighter of World War II, the compromises, failures, and dead pilots that nobody wants to remember. The P-51 Mustang was born from desperation and accident, not genius planning. In April 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Royal Air Force was losing aircraft and pilots. The Battle of Britain was coming, and the British needed fighters immediately. They needed thousands of them, but British factories could not keep up with demand. So the Royal Air Force Purchasing Commission went to America, shopping for fighters. They approached North American Aviation, a relatively small company in California that had never built a fighter aircraft before. North American built trainers and light bombers, not frontline combat aircraft. The British asked if North American could build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. It was a reasonable request. The P-40 was proven, reliable, and in production. Building more of them made sense. But North American Aviation's president, James Kindleberger, was ambitious. He told the British he could design a better fighter from scratch in the same time it would take to set up P-40 production. The British were skeptical but desperate. They gave him 120 days to design and build a prototype. No American aircraft company had ever done that before. Most fighter programs took years from design to first flight. Kindleberger had 4 months. He assigned the project to Chief Engineer Edgar Schmude, a brilliant German immigrant who had studied advanced aerodynamics in Germany before fleeing to America. Schmude assembled a team and started working around the clock. They used a laminar flow wing, a cutting-edge design that reduced drag. They placed the radiator under the fuselage, where it created additional thrust from cooling airflow. They optimized every inch of the airframe for speed and range. It was innovative, radical, and risky. The NA-73X prototype was completed in September 1940, exactly 120 days after the contract was signed. It was gorgeous, all smooth lines and polished aluminum. But there was a problem. North American did not have an engine. The design called for the Allison 51710, a liquid-cooled V12 that was the only American engine available in sufficient numbers. The Allison made 1,150 horsepower. Decent, but not exceptional. More importantly, the Allison had a critical flaw. It had a single-stage supercharger that lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet. At high altitude, where most air combat happened over Europe, the Allison-powered Mustang was a mediocre performer. The prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, with test pilot Vance Breese at the controls. It handled beautifully at low altitude, but everyone knew the Allison engine was holding it back. The British took delivery of the first production Mustangs in 1941 and designated them Mustang Mark I. They immediately discovered the high-altitude problem. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang was slower than German Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters. It could not climb with them. It could not catch them. so the RAF used Mustangs for low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, roles where the Allison engine performed adequately. The Mustang flew photo reconnaissance missions over occupied France, dodging flak and fighters, using its speed at low altitude to survive. It worked, but it was not the fighter the British needed for air superiority. That should have been the end of the story. A decent low-altitude fighter relegated to secondary roles. But then someone had an idea that changed everything. In 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a Mustang and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was brilliant, but the engine was wrong. Harker suggested installing a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the legendary Spitfire. The Merlin had a two-stage supercharger that maintained power at high altitude. In October 1942, Rolls-Royce built a prototype with a Merlin 61 engine. The performance was stunning. Top speed increased to 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling jumped to 42,000 feet. The Mustang could suddenly outclimb, outrun, and outfight anything the Luftwaffe had. The transformation was so dramatic that North America immediately began producing Merlin-powered Mustangs under license from Packard Motor Company, which built Merlins in America. The P-51B entered production in 1943, and the legend was born. But the early Merlin Mustangs had serious problems. The Packard-built Merlin engines were less reliable than the British originals. Quality control at Packard was inconsistent. Some engines failed catastrophically after only a few hours of operation. Coolant systems leaked. Superchargers malfunctioned. Pilots reported engine failures during combat, which was a death sentence if it happened over enemy territory. The P-51B also had visibility problems. The cockpit canopy had thick frames that blocked the pilot's view, especially to the rear. In a dogfight, being unable to see behind you meant a German fighter could sneak up and kill you before you knew he was there. Mustang pilots complained constantly about the canopy design. North American eventually fixed it with the Malcolm hood, a bubble canopy that provided 360-degree visibility. But not until after pilots died because they could not see attackers. The most dangerous flaw in the early P-51B was the gun installation. The aircraft had 4 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings. The gun bays were not properly sealed, and the guns were positioned in a way that caused them to jam constantly, especially during high G maneuvers. Pilots would pull hard in a turn, line up a shot on a German fighter, squeeze the trigger, and nothing would happen. The guns had jammed. Now the pilot was defenseless, stuck in a combat zone with an enemy fighter that could not be fought. This happened so often that many pilots lost confidence in the Mustang. Some requested transfers to P-47 Thunderbolt units because at least the P-47's 8 guns worked reliably. North American eventually fixed the gun jamming problem by redesigning the ammunition feed system and adding heaters to prevent moisture from freezing the mechanisms at high altitude. But for months, P-51 pilots went into combat knowing their guns might fail. Then there was the fuel system issue. The P-51 carried fuel tanks in the fuselage behind the cockpit, directly behind the pilot's seat. This gave the Mustang its incredible range. But it also meant that if the aircraft took battle damage to those tanks, fuel would spray into the cockpit. Several pilots burned to death when fuel ignited after combat damage. Others bailed out covered in fuel, suffering horrible burns. The location of those tanks was a calculated risk. Range required internal fuel capacity, and there was nowhere else to put the tanks. So pilots sat with 85 gallons of high-octane gasoline directly behind their backs, hoping they would not get hit there. Some did. They died in agony. The P-51D, which entered service in mid-1944, fixed many of these problems. A bubble canopy improved visibility. 6 guns replaced 4 with improved reliability. Refined aerodynamics and better engine cooling followed. The P-51D became the definitive Mustang, the version that dominates museums and air shows today. But even the D model had issues. The Packard Merlin engines continued to have reliability problems throughout the war. Some pilots experienced engine failures and had to bail out over enemy territory, becoming prisoners of war or getting killed trying to evade capture. Others crashed on takeoff or landing due to engine malfunctions. Official accident reports blamed pilot error whenever possible, but many crashes were caused by mechanical failures that the Army Air Forces did not want to publicize. The Mustang's combat record is legendary. In the hands of skilled pilots, it was unbeatable. The 357th Fighter Group, equipped with P-51s, became the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force with 609 aerial victories. The Tuskegee Airmen flew P-51 Mustangs and earned a reputation as elite escort fighters, never losing a bomber they were assigned to protect. Mustang pilots became aces, shooting down 5 or more enemy aircraft. The list of Mustang aces reads like a Hall of Fame: Chuck Yeager, George Preddy, John Meyer, Don Gentile. These men were heroes, skilled and brave, and they loved the Mustang. But for every ace, there were dozens of average pilots who died in Mustangs, shot down by the Luftwaffe, or killed by mechanical failures, or lost in bad weather over the North Sea. The statistics tell a darker story than the mythology. The Army Air Forces lost 2,520 P-51 Mustangs in World War II. Some were shot down in combat, but many were lost to accidents, mechanical failures, and operational causes. The accident rate for the P-51 was higher than for the P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavier and supposedly less maneuverable fighter. Why? Because the Mustang was less forgiving. The laminar flow wing that gave it speed and range also made it prone to snap rolls and spins if mishandled. Inexperienced pilots could lose control in a turn and spin into the ground. The liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable to even minor damage. One bullet through the coolant system, and the engine would overheat and seize within minutes. The P-47, with its air-cooled radial engine, could absorb massive damage and keep running. The Mustang could not. There was also the issue of range, which was both the Mustang's greatest strength and a hidden danger. Yes, the P-51 could fly from England to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,200 miles. That range allowed it to escort bombers deep into Germany, protecting them from Luftwaffe fighters. But that range also meant young pilots were flying 6-hour missions. In freezing cockpits at high altitude, breathing oxygen, scanning constantly for enemy fighters, fighting when necessary, and then navigating home across hundreds of miles of hostile territory or open ocean. The physical and mental strain was enormous. Pilots made mistakes when exhausted. They misjudged fuel consumption and ran out of gas over the North Sea, ditching and drowning. They got lost in bad weather and crashed into mountains. They pushed their aircraft too hard and suffered engine failures. Range is only useful if you survive to use it. The Mustang also participated in ground attack missions, strafing German airfields, trains, and vehicles. These missions were dangerous. Flying low and slow made the Mustang vulnerable to light anti-aircraft fire. Many Mustangs were shot down by small-caliber flak during strafing runs. The liquid-cooled engine was especially vulnerable. A single round through the radiator or coolant lines left the pilot minutes to find a place to crash land before the engine seized. Some pilots made it. Many did not. The wreckage of P-51 Mustangs is scattered across Europe, the remains of pilots who were killed strafing targets that had minimal strategic value. One of the most controversial aspects of the Mustang's combat service was the decision to use it for ground attack, despite it being designed as a high-altitude escort fighter. Commanders wanted to maximize the effectiveness of their fighters, so they sent Mustangs to strafe ground targets after escorting bombers home. But the Mustang was not optimized for ground attack. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its rugged airframe and air-cooled engine, was far better suited for that role. Yet Mustangs were sent anyway, and pilots died because the aircraft could not absorb ground fire the way a thunderbolt could. It was a misuse of resources driven by the desire to keep expensive fighters busy, instead of flying them only for their designed mission. After the war ended, the P-51 Mustang became a symbol of American AIR superiority. Hollywood made movies about Mustang pilots. Veterans wrote memoirs celebrating the aircraft. Museums restored pristine examples and put them on display. The Mustang was marketed as the ultimate fighter, the aircraft that won the air war over Europe. And in many ways, that is true. The P-51 allowed the strategic bombing campaign to succeed by providing long-range escort. It destroyed the Luftwaffe through attrition. It gave Allied pilots a technological edge. But the mythology erases the failures, the dead pilots, the mechanical problems, and the poor decisions that cost lives. The post-war air races made the Mustang even more famous. Stripped-down, modified P-51s dominated unlimited air racing for decades. The sleek lines and powerful Merlin engine made it a natural racer. Civilian pilots who bought surplus Mustangs after the war loved them. But racing Mustangs also killed pilots. The aircraft was pushed beyond its limits. Engines failed. Wings failed. Pilots crashed and died. Even in peacetime, the Mustang remained dangerous in the wrong hands. It was not a forgiving aircraft. It rewarded skill and punished mistakes. And when you are flying 50 feet above the ground at 400 miles per hour, mistakes are fatal. The Korean War brought the Mustang back into combat. The newly formed United States Air Force used P-51 Mustangs for ground attack against North Korean and Chinese forces. But by 1950, the Mustang was obsolete. Jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star and the MiG-15 were faster and more capable. The Mustang was relegated to close air support, strafing and bombing ground targets, while jets fought for air superiority. The losses were horrific. North Korean and Chinese anti-aircraft fire shot down Mustangs in large numbers. The liquid-cooled engine remained vulnerable. Pilots died in an outdated aircraft, fighting a war it was never designed for. The Air Force retired the P-51 from frontline service in 1953, replacing it with jets. Most were scrapped or sold as surplus. Today, the P-51 Mustang is worshipped by aviation enthusiasts. Restored examples sell for millions of dollars. Air shows feature Mustang demonstrations. Books and documentaries celebrate its combat record. And all of that is deserved to some extent. The P-51 was a remarkable aircraft. It did help win the war, but the mythology ignores the complexity. It ignores the fact that the Mustang only became great after the British fixed the engine problem. It ignores the gun jams, the fuel system fires, the accident rate, and the pilots who died from mechanical failures. It ignores the misuse of the aircraft in ground attack roles. And it ignores the fact that for every ace pilot who loved the Mustang, there were average pilots who feared it. The lesson of the P-51 Mustang is that even the best weapons have flaws. Even legendary aircraft kill the people operating them. The P-51 was fast, beautiful, and effective. It was also unforgiving, mechanically unreliable in its early versions, and dangerous in the wrong hands. Both realities exist simultaneously. The Mustang shot down 4,950 enemy aircraft. It also killed hundreds of American pilots through accidents and mechanical failures. It escorted bombers to Berlin. It also burned pilots alive when fuel tanks ruptured. It dominated the skies over Europe. It also spun into the ground when mishandled by inexperienced pilots. The engineers who designed the Mustang were brilliant. Edgar Schmood created an aerodynamic masterpiece, but he could not overcome the limitations of the Allison engine. That required British intervention. And even with the Merlin engine, the Mustang had flaws that took years to fix. The gun jams were inexcusable. The fuel tank placement was dangerous. The early canopy design was inadequate. These were not minor issues. They were life and death problems that cost pilots their lives. But admitting those flaws would tarnish the legend, so they were minimized or ignored. The pilots who flew the P-51 Mustang in combat deserve recognition and respect. They faced the Luftwaffe at its most desperate and dangerous. They flew 6-hour missions in terrible conditions. They fought and died protecting bombers. Many became aces. Many more died anonymously, shot down over Germany or lost at sea. The survivors came home and talked about how great the Mustang was, because what else could they say? Criticizing the aircraft you flew in combat feels like betraying your dead friends. So they praised it, and the mythology grew, and the flaws were forgotten. The final truth about the P-51 Mustang is complicated. It was the best American fighter of World War II in terms of overall combat effectiveness. Range, speed, firepower, and kill ratio all favor the Mustang. But best does not mean perfect. Best does not mean safe. Best does not mean every pilot who flew it came home. The Mustang was a weapon, and weapons kill. Sometimes they kill the enemy. Sometimes they kill the people using them. The P-51 did both. This is the dark story of the best fighter of World War II. A brilliant design crippled by a failed engine until the British fixed it. A maintenance nightmare with gun jams and fuel system problems. An unforgiving aircraft that killed inexperienced pilots. A legend built on the sacrifice of thousands of young men. Some who died gloriously in combat, others who died inglorious deaths in training accidents or mechanical failures. The P-51 Mustang helped win the war, but it was not the perfect, flawless fighter that mythology suggests. It was a complex, dangerous machine that rewarded skill and punished mistakes. And the boys who flew it paid the price in blood and fire and wreckage scattered across Europe. That is the truth. That is what history should remember. Not just the glory, but the cost.